From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Clinical Reviews, interviews about ideas and innovations in medicine, science, and clinical practice. Here's your host, Ed Livingston.
Drug prices have been increasing more rapidly than inflation for some time. Staggering prices for new drugs such as sofosbuvir, the new drug for hepatitis C, which entered the market at $84,000 for one course of treatment, or outrageous and unjustified overnight price increases for the generic drug pyrimethamine by Turing Pharmaceuticals from $13.50 to $750 per tablet, have drawn attention to the problem of high drug prices. Hello, I'm Ed Livingston, Deputy Editor of Clinical Reviews and Education for JAMA. In today's podcast, we take on the subject of the high cost of drugs and what physicians can do about it. To help us understand these issues, we talked to Dr. Aaron Kesselheim from the Harvard Medical School and Dr. Janet Woodcock, Director of the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Why are drug prices going up? There are many factors, but there's one basic economic principle that explains it. Companies selling drugs can get away with it, and how they get away with it is in how they price brand-name drugs.
This is common practice in the industry, and it has been for years among the largest pharmaceutical companies, some of the biotechs as well. They consistently will take price increases, sometimes every 6 months, sometimes every quarter, and they can push up the prices of drugs in their portfolio by as much as 10 or 15 or 20 or more % each year, because that's sort of goes under the radar. There's no clear way to see when prices are going up, so we have to rely on other analysis to look at drug prices, but they are definitely pushing through these prices all the time.
72% of all drug spending occurs on brand-name drugs that only account for 10% of all the drug sales. That's the big target. Although increases in generic drug spending get a lot of attention, not much will be gained by reducing expenditures on generics since they only account for a relatively small amount of the total spend on pharmaceuticals. The biggest influence we can have as physicians on the cost of drugs to our patients is to control our prescribing of brand-name drugs. Before we get into that, let's review some of the other proposed solutions for controlling drug costs. One popular idea is to allow the importation of drugs from Canada or other countries where drugs may be sold for less money than in the U.S. Dr. Janet Woodcock from the FDA explains what some of the problems are with importing drugs into the United States.
Well, a lot of people think about drugs in other countries and perhaps they're being offered at lower prices and that there should be importation into the United States. And there are a number of problems with this. The main issue is that drugs that are imported that aren't approved and come outside of the regular channels have been shown often to be either contaminated, some of them are counterfeits, some of them actually don't have the right ingredients in them or might even contain different ingredients altogether. So it's very important to maintain the integrity of the supply chain when you're talking about medicines. And we know that there are a large number of substandard medicines out there in the world.
One particular approach that people have tried is ordering drugs from online pharmacies that are thought to be based in Canada. However, sometimes those pharmacies aren't really in Canada, and the drugs they are distributing are not what people think they're getting.
For the public, it's important to remember that just because drugs are advertised as very cheap, they may really not be a bargain because you may not get what you're paying for. And the U.S. drug supply is very reliable, and that's because a great amount of attention is paid to securing the supply chain and making sure that it's verified at every step that the drugs are what they're supposed to be. And recently, Congress put in place track and trace legislation that makes sure through the distribution chain that the drugs are verified, too, so that illegal drugs can't be slipped into the distribution chain. So this is serious business, and we have encountered practices both by physicians and by consumers of buying outside of the supply chain and getting very dangerous results.
The United States subsidizes the rest of the world in a couple of important ways. We do so by paying higher prices for drugs, and those higher prices go to support drug company research to develop new drugs and new treatments that we'll benefit from. But not only do we benefit from it, but the rest of the world benefits from it once the discoveries have been made. Similarly, Americans pay taxes, and those taxes support the NIH. The NIH is the largest funder of medical research in the world, and many of the discoveries from which drug development are based upon come from NIH research. There are downstream benefits to those expenditures since most of this work is done in the United States. The work results in a very extensive industry which employs a lot of people and benefits the overall economy of the country. There have been proposals for the government to simply control the prices drug companies can charge for drugs, as is done in many other countries. The United States tried price controls before with disastrous results. By executive order in 1971, Richard Nixon announced national price and wage controls.
I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days.
Although initially proposed as a temporary solution for inflation, price controls were reimposed in 1973. To quote Daniel Yergin and Joseph Stanislaw, ranchers stopped shipping their cattle to the market, farmers drowned their chickens, and consumers emptied the shelves of supermarkets. What all this meant was that when price controls were artificially imposed on the economy, producers of various commodities could no longer make enough money to stay in business. Because they had to exit the markets, there wasn't enough food or other kinds of commodities for consumers to buy, and that's why the supermarkets became empty. Economic modeling of what might happen if price controls are imposed on the U.S. pharmaceutical industry was presented in a paper published by Thomas Abbott and John Vernon from the National Bureau of Economic Research. The publication is referred to in the show notes. Their basic finding was that cutting prices by 40 to 50% in the United States will lead to between 30 and 60% fewer R&D projects being undertaken in the early stage of developing a new drug. Relatively modest changes, such as 5 or 10%, are estimated to have relatively little impact on the incentives for product development, perhaps a negative 5%. Just like what happened in the 1970s, price controls on drugs will only lead to a shortage of drugs. The effect of price controls is already in play. Price controls reduce profits, reducing incentives for companies to develop and sell pharmaceutical products. This is effectively what is happening in the generic drug market. The effect of small margins on drugs results in shortages. That's already seen in the generic drug market where profits are small. Another popular proposal is to allow CMS to negotiate the price for drugs it pays for. Because CMS pays for about half of all health care in the U.S., this is nearly the same effect of having the government impose price controls. Prices will go down in the short term, but in the long run, shortage and rationing of drugs will be the end result. There are a number of interesting ways to try to control drug costs. Many of these are reviewed in a special communication on drug pricing published in the August 23, 2016 issue of JAMA. Some of these other means for controlling drug prices include differential pricing. That's a strategy of selling the same product to different consumers at different prices based on that consumer's income. Another strategy is external price referencing, which is used in 29 countries in the European Union, including Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and Turkey. It's defined by the European Commission as the practice of using prices of a medicine in one or several countries in order to derive a benchmark or reference price for the purpose of setting a negotiated price for the medicine in a given country. Another approach is value-based pricing. In this model, patients and insurers pay for drugs based on the health outcome. This has been proposed in the United States. Value-based pricing is a very interesting approach. In this approach, the price for a generic drug that has a certain effect is set as what the insurer will reimburse at. If a patient wants a brand name drug which costs a lot more, that's fine. That's their choice. They just have to pay the difference between what the generic drug would cost the insurance company and what they're willing to pay out of pocket for their ability to have the brand name drug that they want. Now, there's all those annoying commercials that you see on television where drug companies directly advertise to consumers. Then those consumers show up in your office asking for you to prescribe those drugs. That's a huge contributor to the expense of drugs because doctors basically don't want to say no. Direct-to-consumer advertising has changed the landscape for how doctors and patients interact regarding discussions of pharmacological therapies. Consumers now garner snippets of information about a drug and its effect on a disease from a commercial. They then take that information to their clinicians asking about the drug. This has become a very effective way for drug companies to sell their brand name products since doctors are reluctant to go against their patients' wishes and quite frequently prescribe the drug the patient requests. In fact, the physician is incentivized to do just this. Physicians are not usually involved in the costs attributable to medications, and they're now rated based on their customer service. And not giving a patient what they ask for will result in a poor customer service score. Additionally, today's patient-physician interactions are hectic, with little time available for physicians to engage in complicated discussions with patients regarding the benefits and harms related to individual medications. Because they have so little time to explain things to patients, the default action is often for the physician to simply prescribe what the patient is asking for. Generic drugs are compounds whose patents have expired, meaning anyone can manufacture and sell these drugs within limits. The FDA still regulates the manufacture and sales of the drug so that the company intending to sell a generic drug must have FDA approval to do so. To understand why the FDA must be involved, imagine a world without the FDA.
I'm taking high CBD, low THC, and I'm taking drops, and the doctor told me to take it throughout the day, so I take it like a pill, but it's an elixir. I take 3 drops with breakfast, 3 drops with lunch, and 3 drops with supper. And I'm very unhappy that they don't regulate the medical marijuana. So when I see a product is not a good quality product, or if it doesn't seem right to me, I might take more drops during the day. And if it's a good product, then I'll take 3 drops. I can feel how I feel. And I don't want to feel high, and I don't want to get, I want my reality to be, undisturbed.
That was a patient who relies on medical marijuana to treat her chronic pain. Because medical marijuana is not regulated by the FDA, when patients buy this medication, they have no idea what they're getting, and they have to guess how much to take in order to get the desired effect. All drugs were like this before there was an FDA, and because the current drug supply in the United States is so reliable, we've forgotten how bad the situation was in the past and why the FDA was created. Aside from ensuring that medications do what's claimed they do and are delivered in reliable doses, the FDA also ensures that drugs are safe. A weakness in the FDA's authority to ensure safety became vividly apparent in 2012 when 64 people died and 750 were sickened in more than 20 states because of a compounding pharmacy, the New England Compounding Center. It distributed vials used for steroid injections that were contaminated by fungus.
Currently, the FDA does not have primary oversight of compounding pharmacies. States do, although the FDA can step in. FDA Commissioner Margaret Hamburg told 60 Minutes some pharmacies were reluctant to cooperate with the agency's latest inspections.
We even had to go to the courts and get a warrant to go into one of these facilities because they were questioning our authorities, and that speaks volumes to me.
You were getting pushback from the compounders,
yes,
saying you don't have the authority to come in here, we're not letting you in.
That's correct.
The FDA did not have the authority to ensure that compounding pharmacies process pharmaceuticals by the same standards to ensure safety as they do over drugs produced by manufacturers. Compounding pharmacies were regulated by individual states and not by the FDA. The FDA was created to ensure that when patients take medications, they know what they're getting, the effect is predictable, and the medications are safe. These contemporary examples, medical marijuana given to patients who have no idea what the strength of the active ingredient is when they take it, and the distribution of contaminated vials of injectable medications, show how important it is for the FDA to ensure a safe and effective supply of medications. The increase in prices for these drugs is a consequence of this increased regulation, but accounts for the extra costs associated with producing the drugs to ensure that the drugs are safe and effective. The FDA regulates the production of generic drugs. Some say that that regulatory process is what causes generic drugs to be more expensive than they should be. Others say that there's not enough competition in the market because of the FDA's involvement. They say that the FDA is too slow in processing applications from pharmaceutical companies to manufacture new generic drugs. Dr. Aaron Kesselheim, one of the authors of the JAMA Special Communications on the Cost of Drugs published in the August 23, 2016 JAMA, explains how there were delays in FDA processing of generic applications in the past.
What they had found was that there was a delay, a queue of thousands of generic drug applications that were waiting to be read, and that it might take upwards of 3 or 4 years before a company would submit a generic drug application and that application would be approved or reviewed. Again, Dr. Janet Woodcock.
What happened with the generic program is it became, at FDA, sort of a victim of its own success. And right now, about 86% of dispensed prescriptions in the U.S. are generics. So this is a huge program, all right, and has saved many trillions of dollars for the public. So about 5 years ago, it became apparent to everyone that the resources at the FDA were not able to keep up with the volume of submissions of this very successful industry. And so Congress passed a user fee act. It's called the Generic Drug User Fee Act, that enabled industry to pay fees in order to improve the resource level at the FDA for review. And since that time, FDA has been addressing that backlog. But starting in October of this year, any generic that is submitted, any generic application that is submitted, will have a 10-month clock for review. So we will get an answer back to that company in 10 months. And if they have a complete application, they'll either get a tentative approval, which means that they're blocked by patent or exclusivity, but as soon as they expire, they can get on the market, or they'll get an approval in 10 months. So there isn't currently a big time delay. During that time, we have to review the bioequivalence studies, and we also have to make sure all the manufacturing facilities, no matter where they are in the world, and the testing facilities and so forth, are up to our standards for that generic drug.
So there was a problem in getting new generics approved. Congress passed new laws allowing the FDA to collect user fees to fund the approval process, enabling them to get caught up on the backlog. Now they can approve an application, if it's complete when submitted, in about 10 months. There's almost a knee-jerk response to blame the FDA for all the problems related to drug shortages or drug prices. But in point of fact, many companies have approval to produce generics and choose not to do so.
And then we approve many generic drug applications, and we don't know why, but the sponsors never market in the United States. And we've seen instances where there's actually been shortages, purported shortages, at least, of drug, where there are multiple, like 10 or 15 sponsors that have approved applications, but they're not marketing the drug.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. So the FDA really has a very limited role in all this. Apart from speeding the process, which it looks like for generic drugs you've been able to do, there really isn't much you can do. Very interesting point you just brought up, that there are approved drugs out there that people just aren't marketing.
There are many, many. There's a very large percentage. And it's hard for us to tell exactly because we can get marketing data from IMS or whatever to see, but some drugs aren't marketed that way, that would be captured. But there are a pretty large percentage of generic drugs where at any given time they won't be marketed in the U.S., although the market holder has an application that's approved.
Availability of generic drugs goes a long way to hold down the cost of medical care. However, there's a limit to how low prices for generic medications can go. The manufacture and distribution of these drugs must follow the same FDA standards as for any medication. Those standards are rigorous, and it's expensive to comply with those recommendations. Because profit margins on generic medications are low, relatively few companies manufacture them, even if they have FDA approval to sell them. The expense of manufacturing generic drugs is great and has resulted in market consolidations to develop economies of scale.
I think it is a factor. I think that there have been some notable mergers in the generic drug space. Just recently there was a merger between, I want to say, Allergan and Teva that led to that company controlling about 20% of all generic drugs that are prescribed in the world. So, I think that for a lot of generic drugs, if there were 10 manufacturers of it and now there are 7, that doesn't have much of an impact on prices. But for a few of older drugs or more niche products, where if there were 4 manufacturers before and now there are 1 or 2, those 1 or 2 remaining manufacturers have a lot more leeway to raise the price to whatever they feel like the market will bear.
There has been consolidation in the generic manufacturing industry, and with any consolidation, prices increase. That consolidation is necessary, however, to support the complicated manufacturing process and ensure the high quality and safety of the generic medicine supply. There's a general sense that the cost of generic drugs has increased, and in some cases increased a lot. In fact, most generic drug prices are decreasing, and some are increasing, but not by a lot. There are a few cases that have generated a great deal of public interest that have created the perception that generic drug prices are increasing dramatically. Take the example of pyrimethamine. Turing Pharmaceutical purchased the exclusive rights to manufacture pyrimethamine, a drug used to treat toxoplasmosis, a relatively rare complication these days of AIDS. This drug was very inexpensive and only used by a relatively small number of patients. Overnight, Turing increased the cost of the medication from $1,350 per tablet to $750 a tablet, or about $75,000 per month. This increase was widely reported in the press and suggested a vulnerability in the generic drug market because of exclusivity in the distribution of this drug. Although this increase was dramatic, many manufacturers have the ability and approval to make and distribute this drug. Several months after the Turing move, Imprimis Pharmaceuticals announced that it would sell the drug for about 99 cents a tablet. The market regulated itself when other drug manufacturers who'd not been in this particular market entered it when they saw an opportunity to be profitable by providing a low-cost alternative to a drug that suddenly became unaffordable. The CEO at Turing responsible for this strategy, Martin Shkreli, is now under federal indictment for securities fraud and is no longer the CEO of that company. Valeant Pharmaceuticals is a Canadian company that made its mark by acquiring other companies manufacturing generic drugs. As they gained exclusivity on some of these drugs, they raised their prices, increasing the company's profitability. This strategy worked quite well for a while. In 2012, Valeant sold for about $50 a share. Its value peaked in July 2015 at $257 a share. But then it became apparent that Valeant had developed an improper relationship with a pharmaceutical distribution house that developed relationships with physicians to have them selectively prescribe medications that were made by Valeant. They offered financial incentives for physicians to use these drugs. The combination of aggressive pricing policies and the improper method by which the company directed physicians to use its products got the attention of the public and Congress. The stock value tanked. It currently sells for $27 a share, with the company losing $80 billion in valuation in a very short period of time. It's possible that as Valeant increased prices, other companies would have found reason to sell generics to compete with those Valeant had raised prices on. Higher prices would make the market more attractive to the competitors. Eventually, prices would stabilize at some lower level than what Valeant had set them at. Normally, there'd be a market correction as various companies competed with one another to sell their products and prices would come down. This wasn't necessary because the Valeant strategy of consolidating the market and increasing prices and trying to influence physicians to preferentially prescribe their products wound up causing the company to collapse. The strategy caused the company to lose almost all of its worth, and the CEO responsible for that strategy, J. Michael Pearson, was effectively fired as the company's CEO. So a couple of greedy companies tried to make a lot of money in a short period of time on the generic drug market. These aggressive moves didn't work well for those companies, nor for the executives who crafted the strategies. There have been some increases in drug prices in the generic drug market that have got a lot of attention and are very disturbing. However, oftentimes there are good reasons that generic drug prices increase, and that relates to improving the consistency and quality of the involved drugs. One example is colchicine. Many of us were shocked when the commonly used drug colchicine, a drug used for gout and to treat familial Mediterranean fever, suddenly increased in price.
Colchicine was a case of a drug that was grandfathered in because it was so old. It actually predated the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and was grandfathered in, and so the FDA had never formally reviewed it. So the FDA, in a sort of well-meaning way, set up this unapproved drugs initiative in the mid-2000s to try to bring under its umbrella some drugs that it had never formally reviewed before. And one of those drugs was colchicine, and one of the manufacturers of unapproved colchicine, there were a half a dozen or so manufacturers of unapproved colchicine, and colchicine was selling for 9 cents a pill, and there were no reported problems with any of the quality of the product or anything like that. So in response to this unapproved drugs initiative, one of the manufacturers organized a very short trial to demonstrate that colchicine worked for gout, which everybody knows it works for gout, and in fact showed that it did. And as a result of that, colchicine formally for the first time became an approved drug. So by law, the FDA had to provide a 3-year period of market exclusivity for it. And they, took the other unapproved products off the market, and the one remaining manufacturer raised the price to, $5 a pill as a result of that. These kinds of short-sighted, well-intentioned government programs like this one is just another example in the generic drug space of where competition can fail for one reason or other, leading to high prices.
Well, there are a number of drugs, a diminishing number, that were marketed prior to the enactment of many of the statutes that govern the FDA, for example, that require drugs to be effective and so forth and so on. And some of these drugs are still on the market. And we are trying to move them into a status where they have an approved new drug application, so that then we can regulate them like we regulate the other drugs. They can have up-to-date labels and so forth. This program then requires manufacturers to submit evidence to the FDA, but if those drugs have never been marketed under a new drug application before in the United States, then they can get exclusivity of different kinds, or they may have some patents related to them. And then there may be other versions also that are not approved by the FDA. They're very old drugs that are on the market that then come off the market as we transition to approved versions. You know, I'm a rheumatologist, all right, so I heard a lot about the colchicine issue. I understand some of the problems that have been experienced in each one of these transitions, and we've done it many times, have been painful. But, for example, we transitioned the drug called Synthroid, which was used by a large number of people and still is in the United States, into, an approved status some years ago. And that drug had various problems that FDA regulation was really helpful, I think, in addressing. You also can't have generic copies exist if there is no approved new drug application. There's never been an approval. So now we have generic copies, and, it's into the regular way that we regulate drugs in the United States. But it is very baffling to people. A number of the drugs that are in shortage, for example, are very old drugs that never transitioned into the ordinary system of a drug regulation that we have now, a modern system.
Brand name drugs are expensive. What do drug companies say about why they're expensive?
Here's Robert Zirkelbach, whose organization represents U.S. biotech companies.
First, you need to look at the time and cost it takes to develop a medicine, test it, get it approved by regulators, and ultimately bring it to patients. And you also have to look at the value that these medicines provide to patients, to the healthcare system, and to society broadly.
Developing and winning approval for a new prescription drug is estimated to take more than a decade and cost nearly $2.6 billion. That factors in the money and time spent and also the failures. Data show only 12% of medicines that go to clinical trials ever make it to patients.
However, what the relationship is between brand name drug pricing and drug development costs is not known, since this information is not available from drug companies. There's probably not much that can be done about the high cost of brand name drugs. Some of the proposals to address this issue, such as buying drugs from foreign countries or imposing price controls, are simply not realistic. The most important thing physicians can do in response to high brand name drug prices is to insist on the use of generics or biosimilars when they're available, and not to prescribe drugs that patients request as a result of their having seen advertisements for those medications. Some of the most expensive drugs on the market are biologics. Biologics are monoclonal antibodies that affect various pathways and have proven to be very effective at managing a variety of conditions. Because they're large, complex molecules, it's much more difficult to duplicate the effect of a biologic than it is for a drug based on some simple chemical compound. Drugs that have very similar effects are called biosimilars, and Congress paved the way for the FDA to approve biosimilars.
The other thing I'd like to talk about is the biosimilars. We've been approving more and more biologic therapeutics, obviously, over the last decade or so, and that seems to be a big future, at least for the foreseeable future. There are going to be a lot of biological drugs, and they are expensive. A number of years ago, Congress passed a law authorizing FDA to approve biosimilar drugs, and we have begun to do that. We have a program for developers who wish to develop biosimilar drugs, because obviously it's more complicated to show that you're highly similar to a monoclonal antibody than it is to a small molecule drug. So we would expect that as more of these biosimilar drugs reach the market, that will also be a contribution to affordability and more competition in that space.
Much has occurred with generic drugs and how their introduction had substantial effects on drug pricing. The increasing presence of biosimilars on the market will bring down the cost of biological drugs, which at the current time are very expensive. What can you as a physician do about the high cost of pharmaceuticals? You can actually do quite a bit because we, the physicians, are the ones who prescribe these medications. First and foremost, when a patient comes into your office asking to prescribe a medication that they saw in an advertisement, just say no. Oftentimes those medications are not the right ones for the patient, and you need to be prepared to explain all this to them. The other and most important intervention is to use generic drugs or biosimilars whenever they're available. As we've heard on this podcast, they are absolutely identical in their efficacy and safety as their brand name counterparts, and there's absolutely no reason to prescribe a brand name drug when a generic equivalent exists. Thanks for listening. Links to the articles discussed in this podcast are available in the show notes for this episode. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, go to itunes.com/JAMA Network and subscribe. While you're there, check out our entire roster of Clinical Reviews podcasts. All of our podcasts are available in Stitcher. If you're in iTunes and you subscribe to the podcast, please rate it. That helps other clinicians find these podcasts. I welcome your questions, comments, and feedback. The best way to reach me is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @EHLJAMA. Once again, I'm Ed Livingston, Deputy Editor of Clinical Reviews and Education for JAMA, and I'll be back soon with another episode of the JAMA Clinical Reviews. You can get CME for listening to this podcast by going to the August 23rd Special Communication article by Kesselheim, clicking on the CME tab, and taking the quiz. Michelle Krasinski did the production and editing for this episode. Thanks to Lisa Harden for scheduling our guests. The JAMA Network audio team also includes Eric Butkus and Daniel Morrow.